Hi, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're heading into our fourth week of our daily history videos. When we started, it seemed like it's been a long time, even though time's going kind of slowly each day. It seems like it forever ago that we started these, but if you're hanging in there with them, thanks so much. Today we're going to head over to Clifton Mansion in Clifton Park. That's between Hartford and Bel Air Road, just on the southern end of Herring Run, if you know where that is. And we're going to talk about Clifton Mansion. It was the summer home of the philanthropist Johns Hopkins. But before that, it was the home of a gentleman named Captain Henry Thompson. Thompson was born in England, came over to Baltimore in the late 1700s, and built a country house at Clifton. He was also the head of a horse brigade during the War of 1812 and was the head of the Port Deposit Railroad and I believe the Merchants Bank. So he was a prominent citizen in his own right. But by the 1830s, he had sold the property. I think it went through one intermediate owner and then ended up in the hands of Johns Hopkins. And if you're out there saying, well, this is a little bit of an awkward situation, I'm listening to a guy named Johns Hopkins talk about another guy named Johns Hopkins, there must be a relation. And there is a relation. I am not a genealogist, but I believe we shared grandparents. His grandparents were also my great-grandparents, I think to the sixth power, maybe seventh power. And if there's a word out there, if you're a genealogist and there's a word out there for what that is, please let me know. I'm not sure what it was. The famous one, of course, never had any kids. He was in love with his first cousin, Elizabeth, and the Quaker Church was not going to have any of that. First cousins were not allowed to marry in the Quaker Church. And maybe sadly, neither of them ever married. Hopkins, of course, ended up founding the hospital and the university. Later in his life, and his bequests were the funding sources for those. But in his middle years, he had his summer estate at Clifton Mansion. It's now the home of Civic Works, a great nonprofit organization that does education and training programs for youth. But back in Hopkins's day, it was quite an estate. From the house that he bought, Thompson's house, he expanded it into an Italianate villa. From the top of the tower, he would stand with an hourglass, not an hourglass, a spyglass, and look out at the harbor to see if ships that were carrying his goods had come in. If he saw the flag that he recognized, he'd get in his carriage and head on down. The rooms were just absolutely spectacular. Hopkins was quite wealthy. In fact, his friend, Robert Garrett of the B&O Railroad Garrett family, once remarked that the only person he knew that loved making money more than himself was Johns Hopkins. And Hopkins was apparently quite good at it. He was born in Anne Arundel County, and his family owned a plantation, including enslaved people. But somewhere when he was a young teenager, his family decided to emancipate their slaves. And that was good for a whole lot of reasons, but it wasn't good for one reason for Hopkins, is that he ended up having to spend more time on the farm rather than in school. Eventually, and he was clearly not cut out for farm work. Eventually, he convinced his parents to let him go work with his uncle in Baltimore at a dry goods trading company. His uncle, I think he was age 17 at that point, his uncle soon after that decided that he was going to go become a Quaker evangelist and try to convince Native Americans in the West to convert to Quakerism. I'm not sure how well that worked, but he was gone for an extended period of time, I think about a year. And when he came back, Hopkins had turned the dry goods business into a flourishing enterprise. Hopkins is probably best known as the chief financial supporter of the B&O Railroad, the chief investor and head of its powerful finance committee. One of the neat things that I guess if you are head of the B&O Railroad's finance committee and you build a summer estate close to a B&O Railroad line, you can essentially have your own stop. And so there was actually a B&O Railroad stop at Clifton, so Hopkins's guests didn't have to have the inconvenience of going into Baltimore and then taking a horse and buggy out. Hopkins would just tell the train driver to, well, just make a short stop here when you're on your way, and then be able to get off. The Clifton Mansion, after Hopkins' death, he envisioned it as being the centerpiece of the Hopkins University campus. His trustees weren't going for that, and eventually around 1900 or so, did a land swap and sold the estate to the city. The city got a great new park, and Hopkins got its campus at Homewood. The rooms in the mansion right now are being restored unbelievably. I mean, it's magnificent to the 10th degree. The building had become for a while the clubhouse for the golf course that's right nearby, which sounds like it might be a good use, but in fact was maybe not so good. The golfers wore their spiked shoes all over the 150-year-old wood floors. And at one point, one of the parlor rooms was converted into the men's restroom. So over the last 25 years, Civic Works and the Friends of Clifton Mansion have been turning the mansion back into its glorious state. First with a dining room, then with the stair tower, the main entrance and the stair tower of the Italianate tower part of it. And then just recently, the unbelievable dining room. And I'll wrap up with one thought. About 5 or 6 years ago, a friend of mine, Henry Johnson, an architect and designer, said, behind those gray-white walls is unbelievable stenciling, maybe the most magnificent stenciling and artwork of any house in the country. And I more or less told Henry I thought that he was crazy. There was no way that was possible. And after a couple years of restoration work by unbelievably skilled artists and artisans, I have been proven 100% incorrect, and the artwork on those walls really was there, thanks Henry, but really harkens back to the age when Johns Hopkins, the philanthropist, was really in his glory. All right, I think we'll wrap up for there, and I will see you tomorrow.